Have you ever answered a simple question with 3 extra paragraphs nobody asked for? Someone asks you, "Why were you late?" And instead of saying, "traffic," you find yourself explaining the entire chain of events. The accident on the highway, the text you had to send before you left, the reason you left 5 minutes later than planned, the reason that happened too. By the time you finish, the other person has already said, "Oh, no worries," twice, but somehow you keep going anyway, adding one more detail just to be safe. Or maybe it happens somewhere smaller. A friend asks if you want to grab dinner Friday and you say no, but you don't just say no. You explain that you're tired and that you've had a long week and that you promise it's not personal and that you really do want to see them, just not this week, and you hope they understand, and you're not upset with them at all, and if any of this sounds familiar, you are not alone, and you are not too much. There is a name for this pattern, and there is a very specific reason your mind does it automatically, almost like a reflex you can't switch off even when you can feel yourself doing it in real time and wish you could stop. This is the psychology of people who overexplain themselves. Today we're going to look at where this habit really comes from, what it's quietly protecting you from, how it shows up in relationships and at work, and why the very thing you do to feel safe might be the thing that's exhausting you the most. Let's start with what overexplaining actually looks like, because it's often mistaken for simply being talkative, detail-oriented, or conscientious. Overexplaining is not just giving extra information. It's giving extra information out of a felt need to be believed, to be understood correctly, or to avoid being judged. It's the instinct to justify a decision before anyone has even questioned it. It's rehearsing your reasoning in your head before a conversation even happens, just in case you're asked to defend yourself later. People who overexplain often say things like, "I'm sorry, this is going to sound weird, but," before a completely normal, reasonable request. Or they'll send a text, then immediately send a follow-up text clarifying what they meant, worried the first one came across the wrong way. Or in meetings, they'll answer a simple yes or no question with a 5-minute walkthrough of their entire thought process, complete with caveats for every possible objection. From the outside, this can look like overcommunication, or even like someone who just likes to talk. From the inside, it feels like survival. So where does this actually come from? The first root is childhood environments, where explanations were required to avoid punishment. Many people who overexplain grew up in households where a simple answer wasn't enough. Maybe a parent had a temper, and coming home 10 minutes late without a detailed, airtight explanation meant risking anger or a punishment that didn't match the size of the offense. Maybe a caregiver was emotionally unpredictable, and the only way to stay safe was to explain yourself so thoroughly that there was no room left for misinterpretation, no gap where their imagination could fill in something worse than the truth. In psychology, this connects closely to hypervigilance, a state where the nervous system stays on constant alert for signs of danger, even when there's no danger in the room. If your childhood taught you that a short answer could be met with a disproportionate reaction, your brain learned a simple equation: more words equals more safety, and fewer words equals risk. That equation doesn't disappear just because you grew up. It moves with you into your job, your friendships, your romantic relationships. The bosses and partners in your adult life may be nothing like the person who taught you this pattern, but your nervous system doesn't always know that yet. It still runs the old program, just in case, treating a text from your partner the same way it once treated your father's raised eyebrow. The second root is something psychologists sometimes call fawning, one of the lesser-known trauma responses alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Fawning is the instinct to appease, to smooth things over, to prevent conflict before it even starts by carefully managing how another person perceives you. Overexplaining is fawning in verbal form. If you can just explain enough, clearly enough, thoroughly enough, maybe the other person won't get upset. Maybe they won't misunderstand you. Maybe they'll see that you had good intentions all along, and you won't have to face their disappointment, their silence, or their anger. This is especially common in people who grew up as the responsible one in their family, the child who kept the peace, who learned to read a room before they even learned to read a book, and who managed everyone else's emotions long before they learned to manage their own. Explaining yourself becomes a tool you reach for instinctively, the same way someone else might reach for silence, humor, or physical distance when things feel tense. The third root is a deep, quiet fear of being misunderstood. For some people, being misunderstood doesn't feel like a small inconvenience. It feels dangerous. It can trigger something close to panic, a fear that if someone gets the wrong idea about your intentions, they'll think less of you, quietly distance themselves from you, or reject you altogether without ever telling you why. This often develops in people who, at some point, were seriously misunderstood in a way that had real consequences. Maybe a comment was taken out of context and it cost them a friendship. Maybe an innocent action was assumed to be malicious and they were punished for something they didn't actually do. After an experience like that, the mind builds a defense. If I explain everything clearly enough, this will never happen to me again. The problem is that defense never gets to rest. There's always another conversation, another decision, another moment where you could, theoretically, be misunderstood. So the explaining never really stops, and it starts showing up in places that have nothing to do with the original wound at all. There's a fourth root worth naming too, and it's slightly different from the others. Perfectionism paired with a fear of conflict. Some people don't over-explain because they were punished for short answers as children, but because they were raised to believe that being good meant being flawless, and being flawless meant never giving anyone a valid reason to criticize them. For these people, over-explaining is less about avoiding punishment and more about preemptively closing every possible loophole a critic could use. If every angle has already been addressed out loud, there's nothing left for anyone to catch you on. It's less, please don't be angry with me, and more, please don't find the one flaw in my reasoning. But the underlying exhaustion is nearly identical. Now let's talk about how this shows up specifically in relationships, because it often looks a little different than it does at work. In romantic relationships, over-explaining often masquerades as honesty or closeness. You tell yourself you're just being transparent. But underneath, there's often a quiet fear that if you don't account for every minute, every choice, every late reply, your partner will assume the worst about you. So you narrate your day in exhausting detail, not because they asked, but because leaving gaps feels like leaving room for suspicion. Ironically, partners on the receiving end sometimes describe this as slightly draining or even confusing, because they never asked for a trial defense, they just asked how your day was. At work, it shows up differently. It can look like sending a 2-paragraph email to explain a decision that could have been one sentence, or staying late to prepare justifications for a choice no one has questioned yet. Colleagues might describe you as thorough, even excellent at your job, while you privately feel like you're one misstep away from being exposed as not good enough, and the explaining is simply the tax you pay to keep that feeling at bay for one more day. It can also show up in smaller, almost invisible ways. Rewriting a 2-line Slack message 4 times before sending it, adding, "just wanted to double-check this makes sense," to the end of a perfectly clear request, or replaying a conversation from a meeting hours later, silently drafting the explanation you'd give if anyone brought it up again. None of these moments look dramatic from the outside. That's exactly why they're so easy to overlook, and why the people who live with this pattern often go years without realizing it has a name at all. Now let's talk about what this habit is quietly costing you, because it usually costs more than people realize. The first cost is exhaustion. Over-explaining is mentally expensive. It requires constantly monitoring how you're coming across, anticipating objections before they happen, and rehearsing justifications for things that may never even be questioned. This is a form of cognitive load that runs quietly in the background of almost every interaction, and over time, it's draining in a way that's genuinely hard to explain to people who don't do it themselves. The second cost is that it can unintentionally signal insecurity, even when that's not the truth at all. Ironically, over-justifying a simple decision can make people trust your judgment less, not more, because it can come across as uncertain or defensive, even when your original decision was completely reasonable. The very habit meant to build trust can sometimes chip away at it instead. The third cost is the hardest one to sit with. Over-explaining can quietly communicate to yourself that your word alone was never going to be enough, that you can't simply say something and be believed, that you have to earn basic trust every single time in every single interaction as if it's never automatically given to you the way it seems to be given to everyone else. That belief usually didn't start with you. It started somewhere back in a history where trust actually did have to be earned the hard way, over and over from someone who made it conditional on your performance. So if this is you, what do you actually do with this information? The goal isn't to swing to the opposite extreme and become someone who explains nothing, offers no context, and lets people assume whatever they want about your actions. That's not healing, that's just a different kind of self-abandonment. trading one extreme for another. The goal is to slowly teach your nervous system a new equation. A short answer is allowed to be enough. One small practice that helps is what some therapists call the pause and check method. Before you launch into an explanation, pause for one breath and ask yourself, did they actually ask for this much detail, or am I giving it because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? Sometimes the answer is that more context genuinely is helpful and appropriate. Context isn't the enemy here. The enemy is compulsive, anxiety-driven over-justification given in the absence of any actual conflict or misunderstanding, offered only to preemptively manage a reaction that hasn't even happened yet and may never happen at all. Another practice is deliberately using shorter answers in low-stakes situations, on purpose, as a kind of practice run. Someone asks why you were a few minutes late. Try just saying, traffic, full stop, and notice what happens next. In almost every case, absolutely nothing happens. No anger, no punishment, no withdrawal of love. The world doesn't end because you gave a short answer, and each time you notice that, your nervous system gets one more small piece of new evidence that it's actually safe to stop explaining quite so much. A third practice is learning to sit with the discomfort of being briefly, harmlessly misunderstood. Not every small misunderstanding needs correcting. Letting a minor one pass without chasing it down is uncomfortable at first, but it's also one of the fastest ways to prove to yourself that you can survive it. A fourth practice, and one of the most effective, is simply naming the pattern out loud to someone you trust. Something as simple as telling a close friend or partner, I tend to over-explain when I'm anxious, so if I start doing that, you can just let me know. It takes away a lot of its power. It turns a private, automatic reflex into something you're both aware of. Something you can gently interrupt together instead of something you have to fight alone in your own head every time it happens. Over time, these small, low-stakes moments retrain the automatic response your childhood built. Not through willpower, and not overnight, but through repeated proof that a short answer really is allowed to be enough now, even if it wasn't allowed to be enough back then. It's also worth naming something important here. Over-explaining isn't a character flaw, and it isn't a sign that you're insecure, difficult, or too sensitive. It's an adaptation. At some point, in some environment, this habit genuinely kept you safer than staying quiet would have. Your mind built a strategy that worked, given exactly what it had to work with at the time. The strategy just wasn't built for the life you have now. It was built for a version of your life where a short answer really could lead to real consequences. And it hasn't fully caught up to the fact that, for many of you watching this, that's no longer true. Understanding where a pattern like this comes from doesn't automatically dissolve it, but it does something almost as important. It takes away the shame. It's very hard to change a pattern you're constantly judging yourself for having. It's a little easier to change a pattern you understand, one you can look at with curiosity instead of criticism and say, of course I do this, given what I went through. And now, slowly, I get to choose something different. If you recognized yourself in this video, you might also want to look into related patterns like people-pleasing, fawning as a trauma response, or hypervigilance, because these patterns often show up together, quietly feeding into one another in ways that are easier to untangle once you can see the whole picture at once. Let us know in the comments, what's the moment you catch yourself over-explaining the most? Is it at work, with a partner, with your parents, or with people you barely even know? Understanding when it shows up is often the first real step toward not needing it to show up quite so often. And if this video helped you understand yourself a little better, that's exactly what this channel is here for. Subscribe for more videos exploring the psychology behind the habits that quietly shape how you think, how you love, and how you show up in the world, and we'll see you in the next one.